At my father's funeral, the room was silent. Then my sister stood up and said something that changed how everyone looked at me. She told them I wasn't really his son. No argument. No emotion. Just a sentence spoken publicly. The room smelled of lilies and floor polish. A clean artificial calm layered over grief. My father's coffin rested at the front, closed, dark wood reflecting the soft lights, like a held breath. Rows of chairs were already filled with relatives, co-workers, neighbors who spoke in murmurs and avoided my eyes. I stood near the entrance longer than necessary, adjusting my jacket, giving myself time to enter without making a sound. Funerals are supposed to equalize people. Everyone reduced to the same quiet. That illusion lasted until I looked for my place. My sister had arranged the seating. She always liked control disguised as care. I saw my mother in the front row, hands folded, gaze fixed forward. My sister sat beside her, dressed impeccably, one hand resting lightly on our mother's arm. My name card wasn't there. I scanned the second row, then the third. I found it near the back, on the aisle, beside a distant cousin I barely knew. The card was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. No explanation. Just distance. I took the seat without comment. The chair wobbled slightly when I sat, one leg shorter than the others. I folded my hands and waited. The service began with practiced solemnity. The officiant spoke about duty, legacy, and the quiet ways a man provides. Each word landed with a dull familiarity. I listened carefully, noting what was said and what wasn't. My father's work was praised. His generosity was mentioned. His children were acknowledged in general terms. No names yet. When it was time for family remarks, my sister stood. She moved with ease, the kind that comes from believing the room belongs to you. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice steady and clear. She spoke about loss, about strength, about how our family would move forward together. People nodded. My mother dabbed at her eyes. Then my sister paused. She looked toward the back of the room, toward me. "There's something I want to clarify," she said gently, as if offering kindness. "Just so there's no confusion later." The room leaned in. Even grief can be curious. "My father was a generous man," she continued. "So generous that he opened his home to someone who wasn't truly his. Someone he raised out of compassion." Her eyes stayed on me. "He was adopted," she said. "In every way that matters." The word settled slowly, like dust. A few heads turned. A few whispers escaped before being swallowed by the room. Someone behind me shifted uncomfortably. I remained still, my hands folded, my gaze forward. My sister went on, her tone unchanged. "He was loved. He was cared for. But it's important to be honest today, especially on a day like this. Honest." The word carried weight when spoken by someone who believed it belonged to them. She returned to her seat. My mother did not look back. She did not correct her. She did not reach for me. She adjusted her scarf and stared at the coffin. The officiant cleared his throat and continued, as if nothing had happened. I felt the humiliation, not as heat, but as cold and narrowing. A quiet recognition of a truth I had avoided for years. This wasn't about adoption. It was about erasure. I remembered being 8 years old, standing at the edge of family photos, while my sister was pulled closer to the center. I remembered being praised for responsibility instead of affection. I remembered being told, more than once, how lucky I was to be there. Luck has a way of becoming leverage. The service ended. People stood. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. I stayed seated until the aisle cleared. I watched my sister accept condolences with composed grace. I watched my mother lean into her, fragile and compliant. When I finally stood, my sister was already approaching. "I hope you understand," she said quietly, her voice low enough to sound private. "Today isn't about you." I nodded once. "Of course." She seemed satisfied by my restraint, as if silence confirmed her version of events. She turned away before I could say anything else. A distant uncle patted my shoulder, awkward and brief. "You know how she is," he murmured, offering explanation instead of apology. I did know. Outside, the sky was overcast but bright. The kind of day that refuses drama. People gathered in small groups, speaking in softened tones. I stood alone near a tree, listening without engaging. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't check it yet. The burial was scheduled for later. I wouldn't be attending. As the crowd thinned, I walked back inside the chapel one last time. The room was nearly empty now. The coffin remained silent and unmoved by what had been said in its presence. I stood there a few feet away and let myself observe without emotion. My father had signed many documents in his life. He had been meticulous, careful, quietly proud of order. I remembered the afternoon he had asked me to help organize his files. He trusted me with numbers, with records, with things that needed accuracy. My sister had never liked that. She preferred stories. I placed my hand briefly on the edge of the coffin, not as a farewell, but as an acknowledgement. I heard, I said softly, though no one else was there. Then I turned and walked out. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. This time, I looked. A message from my sister. "We'll talk later. Let things settle." I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. As I drove away, I realized something with absolute clarity. What she had said wasn't a mistake or an emotional slip. It was preparation. And preparations can be answered quietly, precisely, and on record. The silence lasted exactly 12 hours. By the next morning, my phone began to fill in the gaps my absence had created. Missed calls first, then messages. Short at the beginning, polite, concerned, each one pretending nothing unusual had happened. My mother left a voicemail I didn't open. My sister sent a text asking if I had arrived home safely. An aunt wrote that emotions were high yesterday and that family needed unity now more than ever. I read everything once and responded to nothing. Silence unsettles people who are used to controlling the narrative. By the afternoon, the tone shifted. The concern sharpened into accusation. I was told I had embarrassed the family by leaving early, that people had noticed, that questions were being asked. My absence, apparently, was louder than my sister's words. A message from my sister arrived just before evening. "You could have handled that with more maturity." I set the phone face down on the table and made tea. I let the kettle boil longer than necessary. I watched the steam rise and disappear, leaving no trace of itself. That felt instructive. That night, memories surfaced without effort. Not dramatic ones. Practical ones. I remembered paying the property tax on my parents' house for 3 years. When my father fell ill and my sister said she was between investments, I remembered managing hospital paperwork, insurance claims, endless forms that required patience more than love. I remembered missing work trips because someone needed to stay overnight in a waiting room. No one ever called those sacrifices noble. They were simply expected. I was useful. And usefulness, I had learned, is a fragile form of belonging. 2 days after the funeral, my sister came to the house. I hadn't invited her. She let herself in the way she always had, as if space bent around her intentions. She sat across from me at the dining table, placed her bag carefully on the floor, and sighed. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. I nodded. I waited. She spoke about estate matters in general terms, about how difficult things would be for our mother, about the responsibility she felt to protect what Dad built. She never mentioned the word adopted again. But it hung between us, unspoken and strategic. At some point, she added, "We'll need you to sign a few things. Just formalities. Formalities are rarely simple." "I'll review anything sent to me," I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, in recalculation. "Of course," she replied. "I just don't want delays. These processes move faster when everyone cooperates." After she left, I locked the door and sat alone at the table. The house felt quieter without my father, but also clearer. Objects stayed where they were placed. No one rearranged the truth by walking past it. That evening, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched since before the funeral. Inside were folders my father had labeled in his precise handwriting. Dates, account numbers, copies of deeds and correspondence. He had trusted me with them years ago, telling me I was good with details. I had stored them carefully and then forgotten about them in the way you forget about things that feel permanent. I didn't rush. I reviewed each document slowly. There was the deed to the house. Not solely in my parents' names, as my sister believed. My name appeared there as well, added years earlier during a refinancing process my father had asked me to manage. Equal share, legally recorded. There were business documents too, silent partnerships, voting rights, authority clauses activated upon incapacity or death. Nothing dramatic, just structure. And then there was the will. Not the simplified version my sister had hinted at, but the signed, notarized copy my father had insisted I keep just in case. I read it once. Then again. It did not mention adoption. It did not imply charity. It stated, plainly, that I was his son, with equal standing, in some cases, greater authority. My phone vibrated while I was reading. A message from my mother this time. "Your sister is very upset. She feels you've been distant for years. We raised you like our own. You should be grateful. Gratitude is often demanded when power feels threatened." I typed a response and deleted it. Then I placed the phone back on the table and continued reading. Over the next week, Pressure became more organized. Emails replaced texts. Legal language appeared, clumsy and premature. I was copied on conversations I hadn't been part of before. My sister's urgency grew more visible. One afternoon, I received a message marked urgent. "We've scheduled a meeting with the family lawyer. Please attend. It's important you understand your position." My position. I forwarded the message to my own lawyer, a man my father had introduced me 2 years earlier, quietly and without explanation. He replied within an hour. "Bring everything you have. Say very little." That suited me. The night before the meeting, I slept deeply. Not because I was calm, but because the shape of things had finally revealed itself. There was relief in that. I thought about the funeral again. About the way my sister had framed me as an outsider. About how icily the room had accepted it. I understood then that humiliation works best when it sounds plausible. The next morning, I dressed carefully. Nothing formal, nothing defensive. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat near the end of the table. My sister arrived late, flanked by confidence and assumption. My mother followed, silent and tense. Introductions were made. Papers were arranged. The lawyer cleared his throat. Before anyone could begin, my sister spoke. "We just want clarity," she said. "There's been some confusion about roles." The lawyer nodded and turned to me. "Do you have documentation to support your understanding?" I placed the folder on the table. Not dramatically, just enough for it to be seen. "Yes," I said. My sister watched the folder as if it were a foreign object. Something she hadn't planned for. The lawyer opened it. And as he began to read, I felt something shift not in the room, but inside me. This was no longer about being accepted. It was about being accurate. And accuracy, I had learned, does not raise its voice. The room did not react immediately. That was the first thing I noticed as the lawyer continued reading. No gasps, no raised voices. Just the quiet sound of paper turning and the soft hum of the air conditioner. The kind of stillness that appears when people realize something solid is forming beneath their assumptions. My sister sat very straight. Her hands were folded, but her fingers pressed too tightly together. My mother stared at the table as if the grain might rearrange itself into reassurance. The lawyer spoke carefully, not theatrically. He explained dates, signatures, clauses activated upon death. He clarified language that had been written deliberately to avoid misinterpretation. "This is a valid and binding will," he said. "And these supporting documents reinforce it." He looked up, briefly, at my sister. "There is no legal distinction here between children," he added. "None." The word adopted never entered the room. It didn't need to. Facts have a way of replacing labels without addressing them directly. My sister attempted a smile. It appeared practiced, but unfinished. "That can't be the only copy," she said. "Dad must have updated it." The lawyer nodded once. "We verified with the registry. This is the most recent version on file." Silence returned. He allowed it. Professionals know when to stop talking. My mother finally looked at me, not with anger, not with affection either, with something closer to confusion, as if a long-held belief had been removed without warning, leaving only the shape behind. The lawyer continued, outlining responsibilities, voting authority, interim decision-making power granted to me until the estate was settled. Not because I had demanded it, because my father had assigned it. My sister leaned back in her chair. "I wasn't aware of any of this," she said quietly. That was true, and also irrelevant. The meeting ended without confrontation. There were no raised voices, no accusations, only an agreement to reconvene once everyone had processed the information. Processing is a generous word. It suggests reflection rather than resistance. In the days that followed, the story shifted outside the family, not through gossip, through paperwork. Banks requested my signature. Property records were reviewed. A business partner my sister had never met asked to speak with me directly. Each interaction reinforced the same quiet conclusion. I had been present in places my sister had overlooked. She stopped messaging me after the third unanswered attempt. My mother called once more, leaving a message about how families should talk things through. I did not return the call. There was nothing left to clarify. The public moment came 2 weeks later. A memorial gathering had been planned by my sister, not a funeral, something more social. She invited extended family, colleagues, and a few of my father's former associates. I was included on the guest list this time. My name printed correctly, no seat assignment indicated. I arrived on time. The venue was modest but well organized. My sister stood near the entrance, greeting people with practiced warmth. When she saw me, she hesitated for half a second, then smiled. "I'm glad you came," she said. I nodded. It felt appropriate. During the event, a former business associate of my father's asked to say a few words. He spoke briefly about partnership, trust, and legacy. Then he looked in my direction. "Your father spoke highly of you," he said. "He trusted your judgment." The statement wasn't dramatic, but it landed. A few heads turned. Conversations shifted. My sister remained still, her expression neutral, but the room no longer arranged itself around her. Later, the associate approached me with a document folder. He spoke quietly, respectfully. "We'll be working directly with you going forward," he said. "Per your father's instructions." I accepted the folder and thanked him. That was all. My mother watched from across the room. She did not approach me. She did not look away either. There was a pause, a suspended moment, where something might have been said years earlier, but no longer fit the present. When the evening ended, I left without announcement. No one followed. Weeks passed. The estate settled into structure. Responsibilities were executed. Transfers completed. There were no surprises, only confirmations. My sister moved out of the house within the month. Not dramatically, quietly. I did not interfere. On the final day of paperwork, the lawyer handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note in my father's handwriting, dated years earlier. "You don't speak loudly, but you listen well. That matters." I folded the note and placed it back inside the envelope. That night, I returned to the house alone. I walked through each room slowly, not with nostalgia, but with awareness. I noticed how space feels when it no longer needs permission. I stood in the doorway of my old room for a moment. Nothing had changed there, and yet everything had. I was not triumphant. I did not feel victorious. What I felt was alignment, the quiet satisfaction of standing where I had always belonged, without asking for recognition. At the funeral, my sister had tried to define me with a single word, spoken publicly, confidently, and without consequence, she thought. But truth does not argue. It waits. And when it speaks, it does so through records, signatures, and the steady voice of someone who is paying attention all along. I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me, not to keep anyone out, but because the house, at last, was settled. Time did what it always does after noise subsides. It widened the spaces between moments and softened the sharp edges of memory without dulling their meaning. The house became orderly in a way it never had before. Not cleaner, just calmer. Objects stayed where they were placed. Decisions were made once and not revisited. I replaced the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, fixed the back gate that had dragged for years, and organized the remaining files into labeled boxes. Each small correction felt like a conversation finished properly. People assume closure arrives with apologies or reconciliations. I had learned otherwise. Closure arrives when nothing more is required. My sister did not contact me again. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned she had relocated to another city. She framed it as a fresh start. I didn't question that. Distance can be honest when proximity has been used poorly. My mother sent a letter. Not an email, not a message. A handwritten letter, folded carefully, placed in an envelope with my name written in a familiar, careful script. I waited a full day before opening it. She wrote about confusion, about grief, about how difficult it had been to lose her husband, and realized, too late, how much she had relied on narratives rather than facts. She did not apologize directly. Instead, she said she hoped I was at peace now. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it back into the envelope and stored it with the others. Some acknowledgments are sufficient without response. Work resumed its usual rhythm. Meetings, deadlines, practical conversations about future plans. The authority I had inherited was never announced, only exercised. People adjusted accordingly. One afternoon, a junior partner asked me how I handled family conflicts so calmly. "I prepare," I said. That was all. Preparation, I had learned, is a form of respect for oneself most of all. There were moments, of course, small ones. Passing a family restaurant and remembering birthdays that ended in obligation rather than celebration. Hearing my sister's name in a different context and feeling the faint echo of something unresolved. But the echoes faded quickly. They always do when they are no longer fed. On the first anniversary of my father's death, I visited the cemetery alone. I arrived early, before the grounds filled with sound. The grass was trimmed neatly. The headstone was simple, exactly as he would have wanted. I stood there without speaking. There was nothing left to say. What I felt then was not grief in the traditional sense. It was recognition of how carefully he had acted, of how quietly he had arranged things so that noise would never be necessary. I left a small stone at the base of the marker, a habit I had picked up years ago, without knowing why it mattered to me. Then I walked away without looking back. Later that week, my mother called. I answered this time. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Age had settled into it. "I'm thinking of selling the old house," she said. "I understand," I replied. She paused. "I should have protected you better." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to honesty. "I learned how to protect myself," I said. She didn't argue. That felt important. When the call ended, I noticed my hands were steady. That, too, felt important. The world did not reward me with applause. There were no dramatic turns afterward, no sudden elevation into something larger than life. What I gained was quieter and more durable. I gained the ability to sit in a room without anticipating dismissal, to read a message without bracing for subtext, to attend events without scanning for where I might be placed. Belonging, I realized, is not granted by others when you finally behave correctly. It is claimed when you stop negotiating your position. Occasionally, someone would ask about my family. I answered briefly, factually, without defense. My father passed, I would say. Things are settled, and they were. I did not rebuild relationships. I did not seek replacement narratives. I simply continued. In that continuation, I found something close to peace. Not the absence of memory, but the absence of distortion. Years from now, the story may be told differently by those who prefer it that way. I don't intend to correct them. Truth does not require maintenance once it has been established. At the funeral, my sister had tried to reduce me to a word, spoken once, publicly, with confidence. What followed was not retaliation. It was alignment. I had not raised my voice. I had not defended myself in the moment. I had not argued, pleaded, or performed grief to earn legitimacy. I had waited. And waiting, when combined with preparation, has a way of finishing conversations others start carelessly. That was the lesson my father left me, not written loudly, not taught directly, but demonstrated over time. Stand correctly. Speak rarely. Let records speak fully. I turned the page on that chapter without ceremony. And for the first time in a long while, the future did not feel like something I needed to explain. I did not expect the ending to announce itself. Endings rarely do. They arrive disguised as ordinary days, as moments that don't ask for attention. This one came on a quiet afternoon when I was sorting through the last box from the house papers I had delayed dealing with because they felt final, in a way nothing else had. Inside the box were items that didn't belong to any legal category. No value on paper, no authority attached to them. Just remnants of a life observed, rather than displayed. Receipts my father never threw away. A watch he stopped wearing when his hands began to tremble. A notebook filled with measurements, phone numbers, and occasional sentences written smaller than the rest, as if he hadn't intended them to be read. One line stopped me. Truth doesn't need witnesses. It needs time. I sat with that sentence longer than I expected. For months, people had assumed the story was over, because the legal process had ended. The estate was settled. Roles clarified. Silence restored. From the outside it looked complete. But completion is not the same as conclusion. The real ending, I realized, wasn't about my sister, or my mother, or even my father's will. It was about the version of myself that had quietly accepted conditional belonging for most of my life. That version of me had believed patience meant endurance. That silence meant safety. That usefulness could substitute for certainty. He had been wrong. Not because patience is weak, or silence is cowardly, but because neither should be used to erase oneself. At my father's funeral, the humiliation hadn't cut deepest because it was public. It had cut because it tried to rewrite history in a room full of people who didn't know enough to question it. And for a brief moment, I had considered letting it stand. Not out of fear, but out of habit. That moment mattered more than the documents, the meetings, or the quiet reversals that followed. Because the real decision was not whether I would fight back. It was whether I would continue disappearing. I didn't. The justice that followed wasn't dramatic. It didn't punish. It didn't humiliate in return. It simply aligned the world with what had already been true. And alignment, I had learned, is deeply unsettling to people who benefit from imbalance. Months after everything had settled, I received an invitation, not from my sister, not from my mother, from a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. A family gathering, casual, small, no agenda. I declined, not because I was afraid of seeing anyone, not because I was still hurt, but because I understood something clearly now. Not every door needs to be closed forcefully. Some only need to remain unopened. The need to be seen by those who refuse to look is a quiet form of captivity. I had no interest in returning to it. Instead, I traveled. Not far. Just enough to be elsewhere. Different streets. different rhythms. Places where no one knew my history and therefore had no authority over it. In those places, I noticed how easily people accepted me at face value. No qualifiers, no narratives, no footnotes. I wasn't an adopted son. I wasn't the responsible one. I wasn't the quiet fallback. I was simply a man who showed up, spoke when necessary, and kept his word. That simplicity felt radical. One evening, sitting alone in a cafe, I realized something else. I had stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. For years, my thoughts had always included a silent defense why I was there, why I mattered, why I deserved space. That internal negotiation had been constant, exhausting, and invisible to everyone but me. Now it was gone. The absence of that voice felt like freedom. I thought again of the funeral, of my sister standing confidently, believing a single sentence could reduce me permanently, of my parents' silence, heavy and complicit, of the room that accepted the statement because it was delivered without hesitation. People often confuse confidence with truth. But confidence is only volume applied to belief. Truth doesn't perform. It waits, and when it arrives, it does not need to raise its voice. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. A year after my father's death, I was contacted by an archivist working on a local business history project. They were documenting long-standing partnerships, tracing quiet contributors who had shaped things without recognition. My father's name was there. So was mine, not as an add-on, not as a footnote, as part of the record. When the article was published, my sister did not reach out. My mother did not comment. No family member corrected or contested it. They didn't need to. Because by then, there was nothing left to argue. I didn't frame the article. I didn't share it publicly. I read it once and closed the page. Validation feels different when you no longer require it. That night, I returned home and placed my father's notebook on the shelf where I kept things that mattered. Not because it explained him but because it reflected him. Quiet, precise, uninterested in spectacle. The story that began with public humiliation did not end with public triumph. It ended with something far more durable. Clarity. I knew who I was without comparison. I knew where I stood without permission. I knew what belonged to me without defending it. And perhaps most importantly, I knew what did not. I did not carry resentment forward. It had no utility. I did not rewrite the past. It didn't need correction. I simply stepped out of the version of the story that required me to shrink. If someone were to ask now what happened at my father's funeral, I wouldn't explain. I would say this instead. Everything that needed to be said was already written. Because in the end, the truth did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as paperwork, as memory, as time, as silence that no longer felt empty. My sister spoke once, loudly, and believed the moment belonged to her. I spoke only when necessary. And what remains unarguable is not who raised their voice, but who stood where the record placed them when the room finally went quiet. That is how the story closes. Not with forgiveness demanded, not with punishment delivered, but with a man standing unchallenged in his own name, no longer waiting, no longer explaining, and no longer at risk of being erased.